All right, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to talk through a model of how you would take your standard and actually turn it into daily objectives and kind of the thought process behind that. So, you guys know I taught science, and so my comfort level is really with the science standards, although these are the old ones now. So, the seventh grade science standard is formulate questions based on observations that lead to the development of a hypothesis. And so on my pacing guide, it said I had 4 days to teach this standard. So remember, I'm going to start, I have the standard, and then I know I need 4 different daily objectives. And then in addition to that, I would need 4 different daily assessments, right? I would assess this one, I would assess this one, I would assess this one, I would assess this one. So I start by thinking about, okay, of my 4 days, which one is the easiest for me to plan? And for me, it's always planning backwards. I'm going to start with day 4 because day 4's objective is going to look the most similar to the actual standard because that's the day that I'll be assessing the full standard. So that might be the day that you decide to give your Math Galileo quiz or your ELA Galileo quiz, or it's the day that they're writing the full essay out and you're testing the full depth of the standard that day. So for me, I made it a little bit more specific. So this says students will be able to develop 2 to 3 scientific questions. So I let them know exactly how many they needed to, based on observations that comes directly out of the standard. And then this is the part that I added as the teacher. Observations of photos and real world scenarios. So the standard doesn't make that distinction, but here's why it's important to me. I know that the students, in order to be good scientists, need to do this in real world scenarios as far as like science experiment scenarios. They need to be able to observe things in the real world, and then they need to be able to develop scientific questions that can be testable. But the way that they're going to test that on AIMS or on any other science test is through photos. So they're going to actually take photos of something that's happening and have students observe those. So I wanted my students to be able to do both of these things. So that's day 4. So then I look at this whole thing and I think, okay, so the thing I know my students will mess up on is a scientific question. They're going to ask things like, why is the grass green? It's a great question. It involves science, but it's not testable by a hypothesis. Whereas, does the amount of nitrogen in the water affect the number of people who like the drink? Okay, something like that. So day 3, I really need to talk to them about what scientific questions are. So it says students will be able to determine if their questions are scientific using the 4 criteria. So I taught them a specific 4 criteria to look for. Is it testable? Does it make sense? Is it useful to the science field? And something else. And so we spent all day that day from the beginning. I taught them the 4 criteria. Then I would give them a scientific question, and all they would have to do is check off if the 4 criteria were met or not. Then they started trying to actually write their own questions and check them about whether or not they met the 4 criteria. And so then at the end, what they were doing is determining if their questions, the ones they wrote, are actually scientific questions. So then what other parts of the standard need to be taught before we can get to scientific questions? Well, the observation part needs to be taught. So the thing to know about students making observations is that they almost always confuse them with inferences and predictions. And so I wanted to make sure that they were able to understand that vocabulary and apply it to different situations. So I spent 2 days on this. It actually took them a good amount of time. So day 1 is students will be able to make observations, inferences, and predictions and differentiate between the 3 ideas. And so really this is a lot of like teaching the vocabulary and practicing different ways for students to observe, infer, and predict. Then day 2 was really like hands off, and I increased the rigor by adding real world scenarios. So what I did is, for this one, I actually set up like 10 different stations around my room. Some of them were just had a photo at them, and some of them were little tiny mini experiments. So they would go and they would like shake up the bottle with water and oil in it, and then they would make observations, inferences, and predictions. And they would go to the next station and they would add an ice cube to the water and see what happened on the thermometer, and then they would make observations, inferences, and predictions. And so we practiced all of that. So this is what it looks like to take a standard and break it down into 4 days. Really, like none of these days until you get to day 4 looks just like the standard, but you're building on those little tiny skills every single day.